been 10 days of turmoil for the United States. Protests grip the nation, the pandemic continues, and all this against the backdrop of Donald Trump's battle with Twitter. For analysis, I'm joined by Alan Dershowitz, constitutional scholar, Harvard Law School professor emeritus. He was a member of the defense team in the impeachment trial of Trump, best-selling author of the latest book, The Case for Liberalism in an Age of Extremism, or Why I Left the Left But Can't Join the Right. Alan, we'll start with the tragedy that's occurring in America now. What's your reaction to all of this?
Well, there was no excuse for the police conduct in Minneapolis. When a person is arrested for counterfeiting money or whatever the charges were, physical force of that kind is never justified. If I were in a place where I could join peaceful protests against that, I would do that. But what I worry about is too many extremists, both on the extreme hard right, the neo-Nazis, the white supremacists, try to hijack these kinds of legitimate demonstrations. Same thing with the hard left, Antifa, and people who see this as an excuse to oppose capitalism, America, Israel. They try to hijack legitimate protests. So legitimate protests I justify and would join, but the extremists on both sides doesn't serve the interest of justice.
But the president never knocks the right wing.
Well, he did when in Charlottesville, he did condemn the Nazis. He did condemn the white nationalists. He said there were good people on both sides. I wish he hadn't said that. There are bad people on both sides. I'm glad he said that because there are bad people on both sides. Look, I wrote a column about that in which I said because he's a person of the right, he should go out of his way to condemn the right more often. I'm a person who was generally on the liberal side, so I go out of my way to criticize the extremists on the left, and I think that's a legitimate point to make.
Okay. There are reports that the president was asked to address the nation and he declined. When we look in the past at presidents dealing with major problems, we see a completely different leadership. We see a man stirring the country, Reagan with that famous speech after the astronauts were killed. What's wrong here in Washington? What's wrong?
Well, I think presidents should assert leadership. I think candidates who are running for president must assert leadership. We have a very important choice we have to make in the next half a year, and we want to see who is the best person to lead the country during unpredictable times. Who could have predicted 6 months from now that we would have a pandemic, that we would have an economic shutdown? Probably we could have predicted we would have a police killing because tragically that happens every so often. And there are legitimate reactions to that. But we need a leader, obviously, who can lead during times of crisis. And we're going to have more crises and they'll be more unpredictable. That's why we need to pick people who have the character and the ability to lead us during these terrible times.
Well, your new book is The Case for Liberalism in an Age of Extremism. I'm going to ask you about that in a minute, but one would think based on that you would be voting against Trump in November.
Well, I never disclose who I'm voting for and who I'm voting against. I can tell you I've never voted for a Republican candidate for president in my life. My first vote was cast for John F. Kennedy, and then for Lyndon Johnson, and then Hubert Humphrey down the line till Hillary Clinton last time around. But I make it a policy of not disclosing who I'm going to vote for until I've heard the debates in both sides. But I'm a liberal Democrat.
What do you make of the current argument between Trump and Twitter? Is Twitter right that they can exercise their right as a private organization to edit?
In my book, The Case for Liberalism, I argue in favor of Twitter and other social media having complete freedom under the First Amendment, but they have to apply a single standard, not by law, but because they're so powerful. Social media is so powerful today, they can't have one rule for the right, one rule for the left, one rule for Democrats, one rule for Republicans. They should have a single standard and apply it fairly. Once they do that, the government really has no role to play in regulating social media any more than they have to regulate the New York Times, Fox News, Washington Post.
So the president doesn't have an argument here, or he does?
Well, if he tries to censor, he has no argument. He may have a political argument, and he's entitled to make that political argument. But and he's entitled to seek legislation which would limit the immunity of social media. Those are all perfectly proper within the realm of debate. But if he ever tried to censor the social media or the ordinary media, then all supporters of the First Amendment would stand in opposition to that.
Shifting now to coronavirus, there's no vaccine yet. What you appeared recently and said it would be okay for the government to force us to be vaccinated.
Yeah.
You back
If
that
the
up
vaccine,
legally?
yes, if the vaccine is safe and effective and necessary. Remember, the government could never force you to take a vaccine to protect yourself. If they developed a vaccine against heart disease or cancer, you and I, Larry, would take that vaccine or because we wanted to, but they couldn't make us do it because it only protects us. But if a vaccine is designed to protect us against typhoid Mary walking down the street and infecting us, the government has the right to compel that. Supreme Court decision, 1905, Jacobson versus Massachusetts, smallpox vaccination, and the government was permitted to compel. Many states have done the same thing. You can condition allowing kids to come to public school on having been vaccinated against contagious diseases, but we have to make sure the vaccine is safe, effective, tested, and that there are exemptions for people who have medical conditions that would make them uniquely vulnerable. But there's no room for religious objection because if a policy is universal, the Constitution doesn't require religious exemptions. It only says you can't discriminate against religion, which is why you can't order churches closed, but you can order anything closed that has more than a certain number of people in attendance, and that would include churches.
But didn't the Supreme Court rule that the government has the right to close churches?
No, they have the right to close everything, including churches. But if they simply said, we're going to close only churches or only synagogues or only mosques, that would be discrimination against religion. But if they have a neutral law that applies equally to other institutions, now the churches have a good point. They say, why are Walmarts allowed to be open and other places, but not churches? And the government responds, and they did in the Supreme Court, saying, look, shoppers just move by each other very quickly. They can be socially distanced in churches and synagogues and mosques. They sit next to each other. It's harder. So it's a debate, and it was a 5-4 decision, not surprisingly.
And the Chief Justice went with the liberals.
Yeah, I don't know which is the liberal, which is the conservative side here.
No,
but
you know who they are.
Justice, yeah, but this case is not a liberal conservative case. I can imagine some liberals siding with the churches in this one. I think Justice Douglas might very well have sided with the churches on this one, and Justice Black. But
could the government
it was
force us?
bipartisan.
Could the government force us to wear masks?
Yes, in certain contexts, yes, they can, or they can condition your being able to go in certain buildings. Look, when you and I were growing up, you could walk into any apartment house or any building and not have to walk through a metal detector. Today, you have to walk through a metal detector if you want to go into certain buildings. Things change, the Constitution adapts.
I want to discuss your new book.
Sure.
In which a strong defense against the Me Too movement, and the book is called "The Case for Liberalism in an Age of Extremism: Why I Left the Left but Can't Join the Right." And you deal with your own problems with Jeffrey Epstein and this woman who came forward and accused you, and you come up with a strong defense of that. But now she's gone on camera to accuse you. How do you
Right. No, I'm glad.
What can you do?
Yeah. Well, sue her, and I will, of course, and I probably will sue Netflix as well for having her lie. What Netflix didn't show was she has a manuscript of a book in which she admits she never met me. Never met me. She has emails in which she essentially admits she didn't even know who I was. She never met me. There's a tape of her own lawyer saying she couldn't have been in the places she said she met me, and she's wrong, simply wrong. Netflix had all of that. And they promised me they would put it on as a condition for me being interviewed, but they broke their promise. So I'm considering suing them for breach of contract and for defamation. She is just lying through her teeth. This is a woman I never met, and I can prove it categorically through her own written words. And yet Netflix never put that on the air, made it sound like it's just her word against mine. It's not her word against mine. It's her word admitting that she never met me, and my word saying
Then
that she never met me against her
why
new
does she?
word.
Yeah, you have
Why
no
is she
idea
doing
why
this?
people do what they do. Why does she go
Oh,
on
no, it's
camera
very
and say it?
simple. She's made millions of dollars already doing this. She started by making $160,000 for, in part, accusing Al Gore and Tipper Gore of being on Epstein's island. They were never on the island. They never heard of him. They didn't know who he was. She then made millions of dollars in other lawsuits, which her lawyers have shared. It's all about the money. She's suing me, I think, for $150 million. So if you want to know what her reason is for making up these false stories against me, against Senator George Mitchell, against Congress Bill Richardson, against you name it. She's named, Ehud Barak, the former prime minister of Israel. She's accused us all for money of having sex with us. She just has made up the entire story, and Netflix knows that, and they wouldn't put that on the air.
What is? We only have a short time left. What has this been like emotionally for Alan Dershowitz?
Well, it makes me understand my life, having defended people for years and years and years, how it feels to be accused of something you never, ever did. I have had sex with one woman since the day I met Jeffrey Epstein, my wife. I don't fool around. I don't flirt. I don't touch people's hair. I don't hug. I don't do any of that. And then to be accused out of the blue, purely for money, by a woman who has a long history of lying, and then the media believes it. Netflix puts it on the air. It's absolutely shocking. But look, I'm a tough guy and I fight back. It's been hard on my family, on my wife, on my children, my grandchildren. But for me, I have a thick skin. I fight back. It hurts. It's been very emotionally difficult. It's caused physical pain to me, but I'm going to fight back and I'm going to win in court.
We've been friends a long time, and that friendship continues. Alan, thank you so much.
Always a pleasure, Larry.